Welcome to College Financial Prep's Preparing for College podcast. Today, I'm so happy to have Rachel Kaylie with us. Rachel's a great friend personally and a wonderful attorney. Today, we're going to be discussing student loans and how to avoid bankruptcy. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you for having me today.
I'm so glad that you're here. In working with clients, many people need to take out student loans to pay for college. And my concern is always people are taking out these student loans. Are they really going to be able to afford it, even when I run through the numbers with them? But what happens if a student defaults, if a parent defaults, bankruptcy, how to avoid bankruptcy? I certainly believe in college planning up front, but lots of times things happen. I wanted to talk to you today and have you speak with everybody about what they should know when it comes to taking out student loans.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on for this. It's actually a very relevant topic today because there's a lot of legislation floating around about potential changes in bankruptcy. Currently, the way things stand is that student loans are virtually never dischargeable in bankruptcy. There are rare circumstances where it is, but by and large, generally, bankruptcy is not a way to discharge your student loan debt. It'll get rid of credit card debt. It'll get rid of medical debt, taxes under certain circumstances, although generally not taxes either. But it'll get rid of most other debt. But very often people are saddled with student loans and just simply can't pay them and really end up in a terrible situation because right now, as I said, student loans are generally not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So I do want to talk to you about that because there are some possible changes with that, making it significantly easier for people to discharge student loans. And all those bankruptcy attorneys are kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. There's a lot of backing and forthing. Should we, shouldn't we? And it's become somewhat of a partisan issue, as most things have these days in our country. But it's really something that affects the average person. Most people cannot simply just pay for college for their kids. Most people have to take out student loans. Most people have to apply for scholarships and grants and FAFSA and everything else. And that's certainly your specialty.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second because I can't say this often enough. Student loans for freshmen going into college, they are only allowed to take out $5,500 in federal student loans. Sophomore year, $6,500, and junior and senior year, they could take out $7,500 each year. Anything above that, the parents and the students need to figure out how to take out the money to be able to pay for college. So no, it's not possible for parents to say, oh, well, my kid wants to go to that school, they'll have to figure it out. It isn't possible. And parents aren't fully aware of that.
As the parent of a now 18-year-old, I know that you have to start saving in your College 529 plan pretty much from the day your child is born. And a lot of parents are able to put some money away. But for the average person, putting money away by the time your child goes off to college at 17, 18 years old is not even close to a drop in the bucket of what college costs.
I always say that life happens.
life
Sometimes you're
happens.
just not able to save up the full amount.
That's right. You can have both parents working. You can have people being very frugal with their money and really being diligent about putting money away every month. But the cost of college, I don't have to tell you, is astronomically high. Plus, you have living expenses, tuition, books, everything is on the computer now, and they have to have the latest software and everything, and it's outrageously expensive. The average person simply doesn't have that kind of money to pay for 4 years of college. And I know you and I have talked in the past about maybe, going to a state school or community college for the first 2 years. That's certainly one way to save, some money. But on average, a lot of parents, and I've seen this often, will borrow against their own 401k or their own pension. to pay for college.
Tell me, what are risks of doing that? What's the problem with that?
Well, there's a few risks. Part of it depends on how old the parent is. If the parent is not that far from retirement, let's say 10 to 15 years from retirement, and they're borrowing against their own 401k and they can't repay it in time, then they are stuck with not only the student loan, but then they also have their loan against their own 401k, which has to be repaid, which means that they're not going to have enough to retire on. That's one of the biggest problems. The other problem is if the parents do take out student loans for their children, they do borrow against their 401k. If they do eventually have to file for bankruptcy, which we all hope they don't, but if they do, in a bankruptcy, for the most part, at least in the state of New York, your 401k or pension or IRA is 100% protected in a bankruptcy, meaning that that parent gets to keep the full amount in their pension. But once that money is converted to another form, such as a checking account, an investment account, etc., it's no longer protected. So parents are losing out on their pension and their 401k when they don't need to be. You know, there's always student loans, there's always grants, things like that for college. There are ways to learn to pay for college. There are not ways to learn to pay for, there's no financial aid for retirement. So
True.
a lot of parents make that mistake, and I've seen it all the time, where they borrow against their own retirement funds to pay for college, but then there's no financial aid for retirement. And that is a huge problem that a lot of times people aren't really aware. Oh, I'll make it up, I'll pay it back, and it doesn't happen.
So let me just jump in for a second. So I had mentioned previously, so everyone's aware, freshmen at $5,500. So then what happens? So the parents can either take out a parent plus loan, or it's possible for the child to take out a private loan or the parents to take out a private loan. But if the child takes out a private loan, they will need a cosigner. In 99.5% of the situations, they will need a cosign. If the parent cosigns for the loan and potentially the child can't pay it back, then what happens?
Well, that's where I see a lot of parents getting into trouble. So it's a very good point. It's kind of a catch-22 because your children, generally, when they're going off to college, are roughly 18 years old. They're legal adults, but they don't have credit. Generally, they don't have their own credit. And like you said, they will need someone to co-sign for them. Usually it's the parent. So what that means when you co-sign is that your children and you are equally responsible, you as the parent, are equally responsible to repay the student loan. So often what happens is child goes to college, they're 18, they graduate, they're 21, 22 years old, they get a job or they go to graduate school, and the student loans eventually come due. And all that time they've been accruing interest, and your child gets their starting job making $40,000 a year, can't live on that, and can't pay the student loans. And that means you're paying, you being the parent, are paying the student loans. And when you co-sign for your child, you can't just say, oh, well, it's my kid's money, responsibility, not mine. That's not true. So even though you hope that your child comes out of college with a high-paying job and can pay their student loans, or they don't, and I've seen that too, where, kids come back, they get, they graduate from college, they have decent jobs, paying good money, and just refuse to pay the student loans. I've seen that as well, where the students like, well, I'm, just starting out, I need the money for my rent, and the parents are stuck paying for it. So, but, the parents often don't realize they want to trust their child, they want to believe that their child will come out of school and be able to pay their student loans, and often they can, but sometimes they can't. Or they come out, they start paying their student loans, and then they lose their job, or they move, or have a life of that. They get married, they have children, and after a few years, stop paying their own student loans, and the student loan company will come after the parents as well. So, it's a long-term process. It's not just that you pay back your student loans in 3 years. How long is the average length to pay back student?
Oh, it varies from person to person. Standard student loans are 10 years, but it can be upwards of 20 to 30 years, depending
That's
on,
right.
what type of plan people decide to go on.
That's right.
Um,
So, for that time, whether it's 10 years, 20, 15, whatever it is, until those student loans are completely paid off, those loans are due, and the student and the parents are equally responsible. So, you might have where your child is paying them for 10 years, then all of a sudden they get married and want to buy a house and they want to use that money towards the house, and you're stuck paying the student loan. So it's very important that parents, all parents want to co-sign and take care of their kids. It's just a natural
Right, but
instinct for
but
most parents.
it's an issue of separating the emotional from the financial realities.
A
And,
hundred percent. Every
right,
parent wants to send the child to Harvard or Yale, and every parent wants to be able to pay for it, but
right.
most parents can't. And the hard reality is that if you are in the 90% of us who cannot afford that, it might be better off to send your child to a state school or a local community college for a few
Now,
years, couple of
let
years.
me just address this. Yes, state schools typically cost less than private schools. However, with planning and depending on the household's financial situation and the student themselves, it is possible for private schools to cost even less than state schools. So the key is to find lower cost alternatives, whatever that education looks like. You don't need the $80,000. Your child does not need the $80,000 a year college when there may be lower costing degrees that will better serve your child and the family as a whole.
That's correct. And also some of it depends on what your child wants to study.
Definitely.
If your child is going to school and is studying to be a social worker versus somebody studying to go into engineering, they're not going to have equal pay. They're just not. Although the tuition might be the same and room and board might be the same, on average, somebody in, let's say, social services is generally not going to make the same income as somebody in engineering. So you also have to calculate when you are deciding whether to co-sign loans or where to send the child to school. You have to figure, is this a return on my investment? Is my child going to be able to support themselves on what they're going to be making in the future? This is
Definitely.
something a lot of parents don't figure. And, I see all the time, I get parents all the time who co-sign student loans for their children, and the parent ends up having to file for bankruptcy because they start getting themselves into all kinds of debt because they can't pay the student loan and their credit card and their mortgage and their car loan and their insurance and everything else. And they end up having to file for bankruptcy.
If the parents private student loans and the parents acting as the cosigner, there are some student loans out there where with whether it's 12 months or 24 months of good solid payment history, the parents can then come off as cosigners and it is just the loan of the child. So if that's something that, that type of loan that you're considering, that private loan and going that route, make sure to read those terms and conditions very carefully to make sure that you are eligible to come off of the loan.
Absolutely. I mean, as you well know, it's all a matter of calculating in the future. What can you afford, not just now, but what do you think you can afford 10 years from now, 5 years from now? Are you an older parent close to retiring? Are you a parent whose job is less stable? Are you a parent who, you're barely living, paycheck to paycheck as it is? and then have student loans on top of it? Are you a parent who's got other family members who can help out? Very often grandparents will step in and give give some money, but you have to know your true financial situation.
Definitely. And, goals, both, your future goals as well as your child's future goals. For instance, maybe the child wants to go on to graduate school, whatever the major, whether it's dental, business, law, something else. The child may need student loans for that. What happens if they're adding student loans to student loans? How will they be able to live? Maybe it is better to find a lower cost undergraduate education. So that way, the child can better move forward with less student loan debt.
Absolutely. And the other thing, the parents need to calculate into all of that is how many children do you have? If you have one child and that's the only child you need to concentrate on, that's a lot different than if you have two or three children. Or how far apart are your children? Will one be done with college when one is just starting? Things like that have to be calculated. And I think the biggest mistake that all of us make, all of us, is not knowing our true monthly expenses. When I meet with my bankruptcy clients and I go through their assets and their income and their expenses, I'm always amazed at how little people realize what they spend in a month. Now, certain expenses are fixed. Your mortgage or your rent is a fixed amount. Your utilities are generally, a relatively fixed amount. Your electric and your gas will be higher in the winter and summer than spring and fall, but it's usually within, a range. Your phone bill is your phone bill. And when I start asking them questions like, how much you spend a month on food? Most of us don't know. Most people don't really keep accurate track of what they spend. When I start adding in things like, well, how much you spend on Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and all those monthly little add-ons, most of my clients will answer, well, it's only $12 a month, it's only $15 a month. Okay, but you have four of them. Now you're talking about $45, $50 a month just for cable or Netflix or
Right.
TV.
Right. The
basically.
subscriptions.
Right. And then, I'll ask, do you smoke? Obviously, hopefully a lot of parents aren't smoking, but you have that expense. Do you have a pet? Oh yeah, well my pet doesn't cost me that much. Dog food's not cheap. But that
Oh
certainly
yeah, it
isn't
adds
cheap.
up. I have a pet. I know it adds up.
Absolutely. Even a little pet like a hamster. My son used to have a hamster. By the time you pay for all the little treats and little things for them to gnaw on and stuff,
The
it starts
toys,
to
the
add
vet
up.
bills.
Right. And then when you have to take your dog or your cat or your bird to the veterinarian, it starts to add up. So, it's very important when you're deciding, can you afford college, to really, and can I afford to co-sign student loans? It's very important for parents to take a very hard look at their actual monthly expenses and not just what you think they might be, but sit down for 1 month, don't change your habits, and keep very careful track of exactly what you spend. Keep grocery store receipts, keep veterinary receipts, keep, your credit cards. Are you already behind on credit card debt? Because you're just paying, are you paying down the principal or are you just paying the interest on your credit card? So it's important to know what your expenses are, how far away from you are your retirement, how many kids do you have?
Going back to this, is there anything left over from your monthly costs to be able to put towards college expenses that you don't need to take out in student loans?
That's correct. Am I already putting every month into my 401k? Does that come out of my paycheck automatically? Some people do, some people don't. Some people add in, I'm self-employed, so I have what's called a SEP account. I automatically deduct $250 a month from my, my income to pay, put towards retirement. If I don't have student loan, I still have my own student loan. And that's another thing parents have to figure. I was very fortunate, my parents paid for college, but I paid for law school. I graduated law school in 1994. I still have my own student loan. So, when parents are co-signing student loans for their children, you've got to figure, am I still paying my own student loans, which are not dischargeable in bankruptcy? If I have
Right,
to go that
many
route.
times, parents that do need student loans to help their children do often have their own student loans. And it's important to, realize what you're dealing with now and how to prevent the same situation for our children.
Absolutely, it becomes cyclical. It really does. And all these things, there's so many factors. And that's why it's important to sit down with somebody like 50, like you do, and really take an actual hard look at what you really can do so you don't put yourself in jeopardy of having to file for bankruptcy. Another factor that people need to consider is, do you own a home? Do you rent versus owning real property? If you own real property, depending on if there's equity in the property, you could lose your house in a bankruptcy if you're forced to go that route. There are definitely lots of ways to keep a house in New York, depending on how much equity you have.
And depending
But
on
a
the
lot of times
school,
people don't
so
take that into consideration, and then can't file for bankruptcy because they don't want to leave their home.
and just learn people know, depending on the colleges that your child applies to, some of the financial aid applications do look at the value of your home and your equity in it, whereas other colleges don't look at that information. So, if that's important, you may want to plan accordingly.
And that's something, using you as a consultant is extremely important because, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, so the saying goes. And if you spend a little money now to save yourself a lot of money later and a lot of headache and a lot of stress, am I going to lose my home because my kids went to college? That's something you need to consider. That's where somebody like you as a consultant is extremely important.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I just want to thank you so much for being here today. Hopefully,
Thanks for
we're
having
going
me.
to, you're very welcome. Hopefully through our conversation, we can save people some interest, help people prepare for their future retirement, and help get the kids off on the right foot.
Absolutely. It's really it's so important, a big curse for most people. Most people just can't sleep at night with this kind of debt. And, knowing what you're getting into in advance can really save you a lot of stress later on.
Definitely. Rachel, can you share with everyone where they can find you?
Yes, thank you. So my name is Rachel Kaylie, and my office is the law offices of Rachel L. Kaylie, PC. My website is www.kaylielaw.com. That's KAYLIELAW.com. I'd be more than happy to speak with anybody if they have any questions regarding potential bankruptcy and student loan issues. My phone number is 718-615-9000. I'm here often nights and weekends as well. So if anybody wants to call during the day or even off hours, that's fine.
And we'll share your information too, when we share this podcast.
Oh, absolutely. And my email is Rachel, RACHEL @KayleeLaw.com.
Fabulous. You're welcome. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you for everybody for joining us today on this episode of Preparing for College. Take care.